And I've also been speaking to hormone nutritionist Jo Proctor. She's a big fan of nutrigenomics. She's done, this is what she does for example, for pregnant women. She does blood tests and then she determines a gene that maybe can process folate. And so that pregnant lady, the patient, has to take, a certain kind of folate to be able to conceive or grow the baby in her womb. But anyway, she says genetics, genomics, that's just one part of the equation.
Your genetics holds the gun, but the environment pulls the trigger, right? So it's very much dependent on your environment if those genes are going to be expressed, if they're going to be turned on or off. It's really important to know that first of all. And I think sometimes if you just get a genetic test and you don't know that, you may think, okay, I have this, and it can scare people basically.
And so, yeah, it's definitely some food for thought. See?
Yes.
It's definitely intriguing, in terms of how this field is developed. I mean, going back to Dr. Ahmed, who owns one of these companies and is doing this around the world. So he's coming obviously from that point of view of somebody who buys into this science and technology. What are they? I mean, it looks like cricket. They're in their form. They're not being processed in a certain way so they don't look like crickets and you're just eating something that looks generic. You're eating like a dried cricket, basically.
Dried, deep fried, salted, roasted crickets. And it was so funny because obviously we're not used to it. Our bodies are not used to it. In the evening, Tom sends me a text. How's your tummy? Mine's tender.
This is The Reboot
with Sonal on DubaiEye 103.8.
the UAE's #1 talk radio station.
Welcome back to The Reboot. I'm Sonal Rupani, and we've got your weekly dose of tech news and a look into the future as well. Today, we're looking at the future of eating. Imagine you could prevent diseases just by taking a DNA test. We're going to find out about how this works when it comes to nutrigenomics from Dr. Ahmed Al-Sohami, who is a professor of nutritional sciences from the University of Toronto. We're also talking blockchain and play-to-earn games. They've been described as Ponzi schemes by some, but believe it or not, according to projections, this market is expected to grow from $4.6 billion last year to $65 billion in just 5 years. So definitely something to discuss. Plus, we're going to be looking at some deepfake apps just for fun, and we will get into that. The Reboot is with you until 2 p.m. today. Get in touch with us at any time on 4001. You are tuned into The Reboot. I've got Zeena Zalamea alongside me.
Hey, Sonal.
And Z, now we're going to move into talking a little bit more about the future. Because, we've discussed gadgets. We're looking a little bit more futuristic at this point. And the future of eating. Yeah. There have been a lot of trends that people have thrown out there, some that seem pretty obvious and some that have been, rumbling for a while. The idea that, we're going to be eating edible insects, that this is already something that we're seeing in certain areas around the world, but that's absolutely going to grow because there's such a good source of protein. So there are a lot of startups that have already jumped on this. There's one called Aspire Food Group that's building the world's largest ever cricket farm. Have you ever had cricket or any other insects?
So fun fact, pre-pandemic, when I was producing Tom Urquhart on The Agenda, we had a restaurant owner in studio and his headquarters is in Thailand. He's American, but his headquarters is in Thailand. And he brought a pack of crickets for us to try. And so we were munching on crickets in studio.
What are they? I mean, it looks like cricket. They're in their form. They're not being processed in a certain way so they don't look like crickets and you're just eating something that looks generic. You're eating like a dried cricket, basically.
Dried, deep fried, salted, roasted crickets. And it was so funny because obviously we're not used to it. Our bodies are not used to it. In the evening, Tom sends me a text. How's your tummy? Mine's tender.
No.
So if we're going to make it part of our diet, it's going to be... Sorry. Yeah. We're going to have to ease into it and not just, go crazy and munch on it.
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't even think about that, about the fact that so many of us are just not used to eating that sort of thing. But that's definitely something that's coming. I mean, lab-grown meat is something that we've talked about quite a bit in terms of how much this market is growing. In terms of projections on this, A.T. Kearney, which is a consulting firm, thinks that lab-grown protein market may account for 35% of the global meat market by 2040.
That's huge.
That is huge. And yet I'm not surprised there's so many startups that are going big into this sector. And it seems to me like such an obvious solution. If we have the tech, if people are willing to buy into it, I can definitely see how that's going. Robo chefs is another trend that we'll potentially see. Robots making our evening meals.
Gimmicky, I think.
A bit gimmicky. I think it's not the most practical, is it, to have robotics, sort of a robotic kitchen everywhere. But one that really caught our attention is the idea that in the future, when it comes to eating, our diet plans are going to be completely personalized. And what we mean by this is personalized to our specific individual genetic makeup.
Wow.
And this is something, I mean, it's been actually going for a number of years and it's already available on the market, but perhaps is still something that not everybody would think of doing. Back in 2015, there were scientists who tracked blood sugar levels in 800 people over a number of days, and they discovered that biological responses to the same food would vary wildly. And now we know this anecdotally. We know that what affects me a certain way is not going to be the same with you. But then we just kind of shrug that off and say, well, good eating practices. We know if we have good fruits and veg, we're fine. And, you know, right now there's a trend that high protein, high fat is good for you. There's all these trends that happen, right?
Yeah.
And we just kind of...
Exactly. And sometimes, you know, our GP will say, oh, you've got high cholesterol. It's due to genetics, but they don't actually do any testing to back that up. So I think we're going in a different direction now where everything is very tailor-made.
And that's what we're expecting to see as we go into the future. Because, you know, you think a blood glucose spike and you think sugary ice cream, but some people have that and other people only have that kind of spike with something like starchy rice. So again, you don't know which one's actually going to affect your body in a certain way. So we caught up with Dr. Ahmed Al-Sohami. He is a professor at the University of Toronto, but he's also founder and chief science officer of Nutrigenomics. This is something that is offered here in the UAE, in fact, and around the world. And he pointed out that there are conflicting studies when we look at generic diet nutrition advice. One day you'll hear that coffee is good for us. The next day you'll hear it's bad for us. You get the same with chocolate. All these foods that you hear, is this good for me? Is it bad? They seem to, you know, change results depending on the study. And he said the science has shown that one of the reasons for that is that people have different genetic makeups in their sample populations, that these studies are being done. So genetic testing for personalized nutrition is something that's already out there. It's already available. I asked Dr. Ahmed what this process looks like.
In terms of, you know, where to start, part of that really depends on the person's primary goals. Some people are focused on trying to lose weight. And so when it comes to weight management, as we know, there's all kinds of fad diets. And the reason why they persist is because they actually work in some people. So the question is, can we use genetics to figure out if a particular diet is going to work for me? What's better for me, low fat or low carb or high protein, keto, paleo? So there's a gene called the FTO gene that explains why some people benefit from a high protein diet. So high protein diet is common in a lot of popular weight loss diets, and it works only in those who have a particular version of that gene. That's been replicated in several clinical trials. We've replicated this in a multi-ethnic population. So it really takes the guesswork out of what a person should do. Now, that's just for weight loss. I have other examples too when it comes to athletic performance or heart health or any other kind of health condition a person might be primarily interested in.
And could you explain to me if a person didn't have that, I think you said FTO gene, if a person didn't have that gene and they were trying to do this high protein diet because it is a bit of a fad at the moment, what would that mean in comparison to somebody else who's seeing, really positive effects? On the whole, if you eat well, we're going to benefit anyways, right? So how much of a difference does it really make?
A huge difference. I mean, again, it's not my opinion. That is the evidence based on randomized controlled clinical trials. So we all have the FTO gene. Some of us have a particular version of it called the A allele, and that represents about 20 to 25% of the population. And they're the ones that benefit from a higher protein diet. The others just do not. So when you look at clinical trials that compare a high protein diet to a low protein diet, the effects on body composition, how much body fat they lose, is identical between the low and high protein diets. But when you look at those who have the A version of the FTO gene, there is a fourfold difference in how much body fat they lose if they're on a high protein diet versus a low protein diet.
That really surprised me. The idea that only, this high protein diet has taken off globally, but it actually only potentially helps what I think he said 20 to 30% of the population that have that one gene variation.
That's astonishing.
Right? Because we're all jumping on these trends.
Exactly. And I tried it personally. I didn't lose a single kilo.
Huh. That is really interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe this is something that we should actually try out and report back to our listeners about how this works. Because he also mentioned the application of this in sports medicine. How does it work from the point of view of high-performing athletes as well?
And this test, there's a sport version of it because we and others have shown that things like caffeine that a lot of endurance athletes use works for some, but doesn't work for others. In fact, it impairs performance in those who have a particular version of a gene that metabolizes caffeine. So the service has been available for over 10 years now, and it is available in a sport format. So for athletes, I know we've had many professional athletes, as well as a number of professional sports teams. They've used the test. And again, it's not about predicting success as an athlete. It's about figuring out how best to work with your genetic makeup. When we look at our nutritional requirements in a population, it's kind of a bell-shaped curve. So some people are at one end of the spectrum in terms of their requirements. Others are considered average, and yet others are at the other extreme end in terms of their requirements. So it's really matching a person's nutritional plan to their genetics. And it's not something that needs to be very complicated, right? I mean, when I think of my results, because I've obviously, tested myself over the years, I know that I have to limit my caffeine intake. And so several years ago, I switched to drinking decaf. I still enjoy a warm beverage in the morning, but it shouldn't contain caffeine because that's going to increase my risk of heart attack, hypertension, prediabetes, and now kidney disease, as we and others have shown. Also, I need to limit my sodium intake a little bit more than, say, the average person. Luckily for me, I don't have to worry as much about saturated fat. It doesn't mean that, I can eat as much as I want, but I'm lucky that my body is efficient at processing the saturated fat that I consume, and that's not something that I need to worry about. Likewise, when it comes to vitamin E, again, my body's efficient at absorbing the vitamin E that I consume. The same isn't true for vitamin D, so I need a little bit more of vitamin D. So it's really about understanding, a little bit more of this and a little bit less of that to align with an individual's unique metabolic needs.
There's also been a suggestion that once people know that it's gene related, that they're actually more likely to follow the dietary advice. Because we know that's part of the battle, is actually being able to execute on what we know we should be doing.
Yes, and that's actually one of the reactions of a nutritionist. We'll play that later. But also, a lot of people are saying it's early days. The research is quite in its infancy, and there's a lot more to be discovered.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this is one of those areas in which, one of the biggest concerns and one of the biggest critiques of it has been that, sure, maybe we can start to connect some dots between your genome and how it's going to react, your body's going to react to certain foods. But what we don't know is the impact of, let's say you change that pattern of behavior, what the impact of that is. Yeah. I know that sounds kind of, well, doesn't it follow that if your gene is doing something differently, that of course there would be an impact, but there hasn't been clear science or study on that. So that's an area that really needs to be developed. And finally, is this efficient? Because, the other question that we pose sometimes, is it just tech for tech's sake? A lot of people can already observe that certain foods don't suit them. I have a couple friends who absolutely know they cannot have any caffeine. Zero caffeine, because they've learned that just from the reactions they've had. So can't we figure this out on our own?
Well, that's a great example that you mentioned caffeine, because we actually discovered, and we published this in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition about 15 years ago, that a variation in a gene that affects a person's response to caffeine impacts their habitual consumption. So for example, if someone says, I can't drink coffee after 1 p.m. because it keeps me up at night, or if I have a cup of coffee, it makes me jittery and anxious. That has nothing to do with whether or not caffeine is good for you or bad for you. It's a different gene. It's what your liver does to get rid of caffeine from the system. The idea that, oh, just listen to your body is completely false based on the evidence. And so that's what we and others have shown with caffeine. So the only way to know if coffee is good for you or harmful is a genetic test. We tried to see if there are other ways of predicting whether or not coffee is good for you or bad for you by, looking at withdrawal symptoms if someone cuts out caffeine, or the acute stimulating effects of caffeine, and none of them were predictive of whether or not caffeine is good for you or bad for you. But that's caffeine, and some people, just because it makes them feel jittery, they should limit it, right? Just because of how it makes them feel. But other people, myself, for example, caffeine never made me feel jittery. It never kept me up at night, but I was a slow metabolizer. And I didn't know that the caffeine that I was consuming is actually increasing my risk for all these conditions. All the micronutrients, think of all the vitamins. Nobody can feel if, vitamin C, if they have enough vitamin C in their blood, or vitamin D. So the only way to know is by a genetic test. And again, for those who are trying to lose weight, how do they know if a high protein diet is good for them? They can do it by trial and error, sure. But then, you're wasting several weeks or months, and that you might become frustrated if you find out that high protein diet's not going to work for you.
How intrigued are you by potentially doing something like this?
Very intrigued. Two things.
Yeah.
Because I've tried so many sort of weight loss techniques, and let's say 1 out of 10 of them work, but that's how many I've tried. And the other point I wanted to make was, well, Dr. Al-Sahimi, there was one triggering word for me, which was, or triggering phrase, which was kidney disease. How do you know if you're predisposed to develop kidney disease? I lost my mom to kidney failure. A few other relatives perished because of that. So, I always dread that yearly creatinine level test because it triggers anxiety.
Of course.
And if I could just have that one genetic test, then it's probably going to be beneficial for my mental health to know if I'm actually at risk for that.
Yeah, and I think specifically it won't necessarily tell you, this specific test won't tell you if you're at risk for the disease, but what it will tell you is, hey, if you have this one food, you could be increasing your risk of that disease.
Yes.
If you do, so it's actionable, essentially. You don't need to, maybe you would have more peace of mind to know whether you're at risk for it or not, but this is more kind of, if you don't want to know what diseases are out there that you're at risk for, this is more about to lower your risk of heart disease, make sure you avoid this.
Yeah. So in that way, it's, you say it's 1,400 dirhams. Would I pay for this? Only for that reason, yes, I probably would. And that's just once in a lifetime. You never have to do it again, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's just one-time check. So yeah, for 1,400 dirhams, you can do it right here in the UAE if you're interested. However, we're not advising this. We say do your own research on this because, as we've mentioned, nutrigenomics definitely has its critics. In fact, we're going to get to that in just a few minutes on The Reboot.
You're listening to the UAE's #1 talk radio station.
This is The Reboot
on DubaiEye 103.8.
We're talking about the future of eating. We've been talking about genetic testing to be able to tailor your diet, but in a really practical way to know if, for example, something like a high protein diet will work for you or not, because that could ultimately come down to your genes. And it sounds really compelling, as most things do, but is it, Z?
Well, I haven't really done my, deep research on this. But for me, I would pay 1,400 dirhams just to know which kind of nutrients I need and which ones I can, my body can process.
Yeah. And you actually caught up with a local medical expert from Sheikh Shakbout Medical City, Dr. Nishar Batul.
Yes, she is the manager of dietetics at the medical city. And she said that, she's familiar with it. She's done her research. Unfortunately, there's not a lot to say about it at this stage.
It is a promising future. that will help us to give a precision-based nutrition prescription for an individual based on his genetic makeup. But that's going to be a very, very long thing. Nutrigenomics is being studied on just a section of the world's population, like the whites in America. UK has a big branch of research in nutrigenomics. But the other populations of the world have not yet been studied. If at all we apply nutrigenomics to everybody in the world, then we might be ending up doing things that may not be right because those genes have not been really studied and experimented.
I think that's a really good point, of course. A lot of this research is located in specific areas. If it's not relevant to our population here.
It's not been done on the browns?
Yeah, exactly.
Just the whites.
Only the whites in America.
Only the whites. Well, Dr. Nishar also pointed out that every time there's a new medical concept or new health concept, there are unscrupulous individuals and companies that will jump on the opportunity to make money out of it.
The research itself is not a quackery, but people are piggybacking on this. And then they are taking the advantage and saying, oh, yeah, this is a normal thing. You can see clinics are up there running in many parts of the world. You can see there is a DNA dietitian running, and then those people are just practicing. You can say you can go and have your test done, and then you get your foods mapped. What is the evidence? On what do they play, and who is monitoring this? And that's our biggest fear.
And I've also been speaking to hormone nutritionist Jo Proctor. She's a big fan of nutrigenomics. She's done, this is what she does for example, for pregnant women. She does blood tests, and then she determines a gene that maybe can process folate. And so that pregnant lady, the patient, has to take, a certain kind of folate to be able to conceive or grow the baby in her womb. But anyway, she says genetics, genomics, that's just one part of the equation.
Your genetics holds the gun, but the environment pulls the trigger, right? So it's very much dependent on your environment if those genes are going to be expressed, if they're going to be turned on or off. It's really important to know that first of all. And I think sometimes if you just get a genetic test and you don't know that, you may think, okay, I have this, and it can scare people basically.
And so, yeah, it's definitely some food for thought. See?
Yes.
It's definitely intriguing, in terms of how this field is developed. I mean, going back to Dr. Ahmed, who owns one of these companies and is doing this around the world. So he's coming obviously from that point of view of somebody who buys into this science and technology and is profiting off of it as well. So that's something that's important to keep in mind. He talks about how much the science has grown. When they first launched the company, they had a 7-gene report, and now they have 70 genetic markers. So I think there are a lot of valid concerns and reactions from professionals in this field to say we don't know enough just yet.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it is an interesting thing to keep your eye on for the future as the research develops. I could very much see this be something that, in 5 or 6 years' time is kind of mainstream, that kind of everybody's doing it as a course of action.
Yeah, it's just a lunch break thing that let me just get my genetic report done. Because I want to lose 10 kilos.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised at all. Now, we are going to be moving subjects. We're talking about blockchain games.